It's springtime, and it's time for gardening, and so we have a special appreciation for the images Jesus uses to talk about spiritual things. We're out in the garden, and we can appreciate both the metaphors and the parables of Jesus that have to do with growing plants. And one of the aspects of horticulture is an intolerance for things that do not fulfill their purpose. An intolerance for things that do not fulfill their purpose. In our yards, we are very aggressive to make sure it fulfills its purpose, as we are in our gardens. And so when we read in the parable of the fig tree that the owner of the vineyard says, "Why should the fig tree use up the ground?" we recognize what he is saying. There's an element of judgment in both of these sayings, which I've read for you. And of course, there's a historical analogy. Jesus wasn't talking about plants, he was talking about the nation of Israel. The point of his story was that Israel was failing to produce the kind of spiritual fruit that God intended. Even though God had chosen them as his people, even though he delivered them from slavery in Egypt, even though he had given them the law, they were not bearing the kind of fruit that was expected. They didn't respond. What has this parable to do with us? Because obviously for us, Jesus isn't talking about figs, he's not talking about Israel, but is addressing the parable to us. Just as there is an impatience with a fig tree that doesn't bear fruit, just as there is impatience with Israel for not being fruitful, there is impatience with Christians who bear no fruit. In the New Testament, there are lots of images of bearing fruit throughout the whole of the New Testament. The conclusion I would draw is that we're expected to do something as Christians and not just to be Christians. Many people think to be a Christian, you simply make certain affirmations and that makes you a Christian. I think what Jesus is suggesting, that we need to do more than make affirmations, we need to do something. In fact, being fruitful as a Christian is intricately tied with being a Christian. And as we think about the things that a fruit embodies, take an apple, for example. It's pleasant to the eye. It provides food for us, but the very basic purpose of an apple is to produce more apple trees. The seed deep within the apple is the reason that the apple is there. And to be fruitful in apple language means to make new apple trees. And so if we're to be fruitful Christians, we need to be not only being a Christian and acting like a Christian, but we need to be making more Christians. Sometimes when I read these parables, there's this vague concern that we may be like that fig tree, just using up the ground, just using up the ground. The parable contains the judgment that we should all feel at one time or another for not being as fruitful as we might be in the faith. But while this parable of Jesus is a parable of judgment, it's also a parable that contains a lot of grace, because it tells about the enormous patience of God with people. The fig tree goes figless for 3 years. And even then, there's a reprieve when the vine dresser intercedes. And even after 3 years with no fruit, the owner of the vineyard is willing to be patient, but not just to wait another year. The vine dresser intercedes and says, we've got to do something with this extra year we get. We've got to cultivate around the plant. We've got to fertilize the plant so that it can bear fruit. He says, wait a year. We'll dig about it and fertilize it, and then let's see if we can get some figs. That act of cultivating and fertilizing the fig tree, I think, is an important part of the parable, because we Christians who may be concerned about the amount of fruit we're producing need to take that seriously. If we want to bear fruit, we have to exercise certain disciplines that cultivate us and fertilize us so that we can be fruitful Christians. We have to be involved with worship. We have to sing songs that fill our hearts with faith. We have to engage in study and prayer, in self-control, and in action and mission that leads to deeper faith. Without that cultivation, no fruit is forthcoming. Now, in the Gospel of John, Jesus moves from talking in parables to speaking in a metaphor. And one of the things he says is that God is a vine dresser. Now, the vine dresser isn't the owner of the vineyard. The vine dresser is the one that comes into the vineyard and very intimately works with all of the grapevines to make them the most productive. And one of the things that the vine dresser does is engaged in pruning. Now, pruning is, on the surface, it appears to be a very destructive process. But in reality, it's one which makes the plant healthier, because it removes broken or dead or diseased branches, and sometimes it compensates for root loss. So while pruning may seem destructive, it's a process that's important to the plant's productivity. And I know that there are times in our lives when we feel like we're being pruned, when we're facing difficult things, when we face the loss of a loved one, either sorrow or disappointment, or when we feel all of our capacities are stretched to their limit and we don't know whether we're going to be able to handle the challenges in front of us, or when we feel lonely because we're the only one trying to say and do the right thing when everybody else is doing something else, or maybe it's that moment of self-doubt that we have. And the truth is, we would just as soon avoid all of these difficult things in life, but they're kind of like a pruning process, a process that makes us more productive in the faith ultimately. To mix my metaphors this morning, it's kind of like a test that is done in a lab at a company in Elyria, Ohio. There's a tool company in Elyria called Ridge Tool. And one of the engineers at Ridge Tool was a member of my congregation. He talked about one of the tests they put a tool through. And the test is called the 4-foot drop onto concrete test. They would take a drill or some other tool, power tool, they'd set it on the workbench, and they'd yank on the cord until it fell off the bench and crashed onto the concrete. Because until they did that, they didn't know whether the tool could actually stand up to the work that it was intended to do. And there are moments in our lives when we feel like we are getting the 4-foot drop onto concrete test because we're facing very, very difficult things. But all of these things, to go back to the original metaphor, could be seen as pruning in our lives so that we can be more productive as we move forward. Now in the John passage, Jesus says something that's very critical. He says, a branch cannot bear fruit unless it abides in the vine. And Jesus says, I am the vine, and you are the branches. The branches have no life apart from the vine. They have no life themselves. The life belongs to the vine. And so just to live, the branch needs the vine. But to be fruitful, for certain, it needs the vine to draw nutrients from the soil so that it can produce the fruit. Jesus uses a term we don't use very often anymore. He says, abide in me. Abide in me. How many times in the past week have you used the word abide? We don't use it very much anymore, but we ought to take that specific word very seriously. Because abide means to be constantly with someone. And most Christians are not constantly with Jesus, not constantly thinking about God. They just visit in a while. Maybe they come on Sunday morning, or maybe they come on Easter and Christmas, but that's very different than abiding. You know, in our last hymn, we sang about Jesus abiding in us, and the question is, do we abide back, or do we absent ourselves? The parable makes it clear that if we're to find meaning and spiritual health, we can't do it apart from our constant relationship to God, let alone bear fruit. Remember Jesus' words, apart from me, you can do nothing. In both of these scriptures, it's very clear that God's intention is that we be fruitful disciples. And I want to go back to the original parable because it's totally open-ended. Jesus ends the parable without telling us whether that fig tree produced fruit at the end of the next year. We don't know how the story turns out. And the reality is, we don't know how the story turns out with us either, because the outcome is open for us. It's up to us whether or not we become fruitful in the faith. The outcome is open. It's up to us. Let's pray.